All right, welcome back to, I think now this is part 4 of literary criticism, going a little longer than I expected. We're going to look at 3 types of criticism today. Biographical criticism, the Chicago School, also known as Neo-Aristotelianism, which is a word I guarantee you I will mess up multiple times during the course of this video, and Deconstructionist criticism. So we've got 3 different schools for today. So let's get into it. We're starting with biographical criticism. And one distinction of biographical criticism that sets it apart from some of the other forms that we've looked at is that it's not really a school of criticism, which is to say that as a method, it's very hard to look at biographical criticism in a way where you have one collective movement in the same way that you can with like archetypal criticism, where you have a very clear movement of people who are all doing the same thing at the same time. Biographical criticism is centuries old. It actually starts in the Enlightenment, though it doesn't necessarily become the same as it will be down the road at that point. But Samuel Johnson wrote Lives of the Poets in the 1700s, and he is considered to be one of the first biographical critics of literature. If you recognize his painting, that's probably because it's also been made into a meme, because he's looking kind of perplexed there as he looks at it. Biographical criticism is very valuable to people who are doing criticism of literature. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that we use it all the time with people like Shakespeare. And it really looks at authors as distinctive people and how that influences the texts that they write. It's worth noting biographical criticism is more than necessarily just a study of the author's lives. It also sort of tries to look at how their texts are shaped, though it's not strictly formalist. So, for instance, you may not see a biographical critic talk about how Shakespeare's sonnets are informed by the sonnet structure that's coming from Italy, but you will hear them say how his sonnets are shaped by sort of this patron that he has that commissions a lot of his work. So that's something to consider for biographical criticism, is that you have this very personal approach to looking at a text. What makes this author write this thing? And that sets it apart from historical criticism and also Marxist criticism, which has a similar approach in some ways. Next, we have the Chicago School. And it's also called Neo-Aristotelianism because they picked up a lot of Aristotle's ideas, both in terms of they don't view formalism as a dirty word. So they do have a lot of formalist methods. Things like Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey would be very popular among Chicago School type critics and Neo-Aristotelians. They took a step back and really asked what the purpose of criticism was. What are we trying to do here? And to that end, they sort of decided, hey, we're going to use all these different tools. So we're going to use a method called pluralism, where we're taking basically all these different approaches and trying to combine them. Given the fact that this sort of university system that birthed Neo-Aristotelianism also is responsible for a lot of the education theory in the US and a lot of sort of the humanities in general in the US. It's probably fair to say that the Chicago School has the largest impact on K-12 curriculum, how we teach literature in the US. You could argue to the contrary. A lot recently has been placed on deconstructionist methodologies in sort of deconstructing literature rather than doing strictly an analysis of literature. And you could also argue, well, but most people who are sort of using this method couldn't articulate that they're doing it, and what we see at K-12 is just a bunch of people taking things out of a toolkit and using them without having a lot of really deep background. As a teacher myself, I find that kind of offensive, but the truth is that it is also kind of true. So the same allegation that can be made against some of the other people where it's like, well, you're just cherry picking things, doesn't apply to the real Chicago School. They're very careful and very disciplined. But as far as if you were to say, well, they're shaping U.S. education, it's like, no, U.S. education is just basically made by the lowest bidder and good enough for government work. And then we get into deconstructionism. And this is where postmodernism becomes serious. Because up to this point, basically everything that we're looking at has been both chronologically modern and philosophically modern. Or at the very least, philosophically aligned with the Enlightenment, in the case of biographical criticism, which has a very smooth transition into modernity, because sort of the break between Enlightenment and Romantics is you go from individual and reason to individual and emotion, but between Enlightenment and modernism, all you do is you lose some of the focus on the individual. So modernism is much more about reason than the individual. So very biographical criticism very easily transitions into a modern philosophical framework. Deconstructionism, postmodernity is complicated. And one of the reasons for that is that the people who write postmodern texts are not always interested in being particularly clear, either because as a critic, people would say, well, they're intentionally being obscurant and trying to prevent people from knowing what they're really saying, but also because they are quite complicated just in terms of their theories and evaluations of things, and they don't do straightforward stuff. They very much have issues with that, and I have the Mario Bros meme here with Mario and Luigi that sort of goes over that. So the modernist would say many things no longer hold meanings for the average person. So, for instance, Nietzsche's Death of God, again, is sort of the death knell of the Enlightenment and Romanticism and this move into modernity. Though Nietzsche himself is very much almost romantic in his worldview. Postmodernism takes it a different direction and says, well, meaning's sort of a lie. There's no such thing as meaning. There's not even really such a thing as truth. And so one of the things that deconstructionist critics try to do is sort of pick apart coherence. So they're saying, hey, look, these are all tools to an end being used by people with agendas. And to that extent, they very heavily focus on tearing things apart. And the quality of deconstructionist critics goes all over the place. There are actually some really good deconstructionist critics that can sort of prove at times that the emperor has no clothes, so to speak, and they find someone who's spouting nonsense and really tear them apart for it. Then you have deconstructionists who are really just making word salad, and bearing in mind that postmodernism and a lot of the movements that come out of it are already sort of into obscurantism, which means that they don't care to be clear. They're very much for people who have already been initiated. Unless you're really familiar with sort of the language and whatnot, it's hard to know if they're doing it in a quote-unquote right way within that framework. And then there's some questions of whether or not it's even the right framework to use. There was an event called the So-Called Affair, I believe in the 70s, but maybe it was in the 80s, where a guy submitted a paper that was literally gibberish to an academic journal, and it got published anyway, despite the fact that it was deliberately created to be entirely meaningless. And then in the 2000s, I believe in the noughties, we had what was called So-Called Squared, where it was sort of a second hoax involving dozens of papers and institutions that all had this sort of postmodernist, deconstructionist view of things. And it really showed that a lot of the deconstructionist scholarship, there are no gatekeepers really making sure that what's going into the sort of public consumption, not that most people can engage with postmodern academic thought, it's very, again, obtuse, but even the scholars don't really pay attention to what's going on. Deconstructionism, the postmodernists are post-Marxist. And that's important because Marx has this view of history as sort of this great march. And there's this conflict between sort of the proletariat, who are the working classes, and the bourgeoisie, who are sort of the ruling elite, kind of. And in Marx's worldview, he believed that there was going to be sort of this constant struggle, and eventually you'd reach sort of the end of history. And postmodernists adopt some of Marx's theories, not others. They're very interested in hierarchies of power. but they don't necessarily think in terms of proletariat and bourgeoisie. Oftentimes they use race or gender or stuff like that as hierarchies of power that they then look at. And so deconstructionism often looks at how are these hierarchies in play in a text. So let's sum up with some pros and cons of each. They're very different in terms of how they come together. One new quality that these all share, Chicago School maybe a little less than some of the others, is that they analyze outside the text. And this is more so than archetypal criticism, because Jung would say basically you have to evaluate every symbol for its meaning in this particular context, and Frey would say you're really looking at things through a structural method, so you're looking into the text, you're not really bringing a whole lot of your analysis in from the outside other than the framework in which you're analyzing. So biographical criticism is very strong because it touches on the life of the author. That's something that really is important. Authors are very heavily shaped by their lives when it comes down to what they're writing and how they're writing it. Biographical criticism is very well established and people have gotten very good at it. There are some great works that have been done of biographical literary criticism. Just make sure if you're looking for those, don't just do a biography of an author, look for specifically a biography that focuses on literary criticism, though that's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but just make sure, like if you read a biography of Shakespeare, it might or might not touch on his work. Probably it would with Shakespeare, but like some of the more modern writers, there's enough biographical information about them that you could technically write a biography of them without touching on their work. And again, biographical criticism has very early texts, which can be interesting because you can see how they've changed over the years in terms of how they approach things, especially as different philosophies move in this shift between Enlightenment and modernism. There's even postmodern biographical criticism that's distinct from deconstructionism, though it has some of the same philosophical tenets. Biographical criticism is more about comparing the author and events in the text, so it doesn't do formalism, it doesn't look at the structure. One thing that can be missed is when the authors are doing things for some reason that's not transparent to a biographer. And again, with biographical literary criticism, you're not looking at writing as writing, you're looking at writing as a product of someone, which is fine. It's not usually a problem, but it can be a problem, especially with, sometimes form is important. The formalists do have that right. If you have like a poem or a short story or an epic, those shape the different methods that a writer is going to use. The Chicago Neo-Aristotelian approach is very well balanced. Its use of many tools means versatility without cherry picking. The downside there, it requires great expertise because you need to be able to use all the different approaches well. And one of the downsides there is you can really only master so much. So if you're spreading your efforts across too many places, you might never really provide as good an analysis as you could if you focused on a single school. The counterpart is when you see someone use that balanced approach, they're very rarely going to make an awful piece of criticism that's not worth bothering with. Another downside, which I forgot to put on this slide, is that with the Chicago Neo-Aristotelian method, you can often sort of cross-pollinate between ideas in a way that seems related but may not be. So for instance, if you're combining sort of biographical with archetypal, for instance, you might be tempted to bring stuff in that wouldn't work across those schools. But one of the things about being good with the Neo-Aristotelian approach would be that you would typically plan on sort of controlling for that. You would want to be careful to make sure that your methods are being applied properly. Another thing that's a strength that I forgot to put on here is because they ask why and what the purpose is, even though they come to a somewhat different approach than, say, the classical and medieval or Enlightenment and Romantic thinkers, they're much better at sort of creating a coherent framework with which to assess texts than some of the others. Deconstructionist criticism, really good at finding things that went sort of unexamined for centuries, because they're all about tearing stuff apart, One upside of that is that you get down into the gears and the levers. There's a lot of focus on language and deconstructionism that is often sort of a meaningless waste of time, but it's often quite good for sort of looking at things. Well, why did they say this? Why did they say that? Deconstructionists tend to be very pragmatic. They use whatever they think can help them deconstruct the texts. And they also evaluate culture typically. Now, one issue is the deconstructionists often evaluate culture very poorly because they're postmodernists and they don't always understand things that are unlike what they're expecting, which is where we get into a downside. Deconstructionists tend to be very dogmatic, especially in academia. Basically, the longer you're deconstructing things, the more that you are to approach this sort of hive mind consensus, and that's not typically good. It's hard to evaluate the quality of deconstructionist critics because the terminology and methodology is very unique to that style, and you need to get good at it before you can really appreciate it. And you also have just rampant obscurantism, which means that the deconstructionists don't care if you understand them. They're writing to write in a certain way. And by the way, this includes the structuralist movement with a capital S, not lower capital or not lowercase s structuralism, where you're looking at like text structures, capital S structuralism, where you're looking at sort of the structures that created fiction. And that's sort of an almost neo-Marxist approach, because Marx will talk about how writers are sort of a product of the context of their times. So there's that distinction there. So yeah, 3 schools for today: biographical, which focuses on people's lives and then how that plays into the text; Neo-Aristotelian, where they are going to be using a variety of methods to sort of figure out why we write, what the purpose is, and how we write; and deconstructionist criticism, which is part of the postmodern movement. All right, that's it for today, and I'll catch you all tomorrow.